So, progressing on the theme of the elements of drawing, we started out with the tetractys, then we talked about uh, beginning with a point. Once we removed that, then we are left with either a dot or a mark, and then we progressed to a line, and then we talked about shapes. So, we had organic shapes and we had geometric shapes. And then our ultimate goal was to then using line only was to progress to creating form, three-dimensional form. And our initial stages, we were talking about how can we do that using line only. The next step in the process is the understanding of the elements of shading. So we're going to progress here and talk a little bit about shading and ultimately, the elements of shading consist of all, when you're shading an object, for example, that we have an egg-shaped oval here. So we need to have a highlight, we need to have light, we need to have a halftone, we need to have core shadow, reflected light, and then depending on the placement of the object, we would then have a cast shadow. So I've been around lots of other artists and seen lots of different instructional ideas and whatnot, and I've heard people say that they have up to 100 values and so forth. But ultimately, these are the only elements of shading that really matter. You must have these elements of shading in your work to create something that is three-dimensional. So we'll do a couple little demonstrations here of shading an egg-shaped oval and explain the process of shading. So before we begin, in the natural world, most light comes from above. Generally speaking, light would come from the sun if we were in an outdoor setting. In an indoors environment, it usually comes from the lighting that's held above. So we always want light coming from above. In this particular case, I'm going to have the light coming from above, from the upper left, so casting a shadow onto the lower right. The reason I'm choosing to do that is because in our society, Western civilization, we tend to read from left to right. So it is more natural for us to see shadows or shading where the light comes from the left and the cast shadow falls, or the lighting comes from the left and the cast shadow falls down to the right. So if we grow up in the eastern part of the world, frequently they read from right to left, so you might be more comfortable with seeing it that way. When I'm doing large compositional pieces, sometimes I have multiple light sources, depending on the mood and so forth that I'm trying to express. So you can really kind of play around with lighting and shading, but ultimately you want to master the understanding of the basic principles and elements of shading before you progress to that point. So for today's purposes, we're going to have the light coming from the above and from the upper left-hand side with the shadow falling down to the right. So we'll begin with here. We have the egg-shaped oval. If light's coming from up here, then everything on this side, and if you'll notice here, I kept this very light. So in the end, I'm hoping that you will not see any of the line. And remember to do that in your drawings. Always keep your drawing as light as possible so you can make changes if need be. And then also, so when you're shading, the line will no longer show. You just want to see the value. Also, I don't use smudge stick or anything to shade. I want it to be very clean and precise, so I try to never use smudge stick or any kind of smearing techniques when I'm shading. That's a personal choice. A little harder to do that, but you get something that's very nice in the end. So going back here, we have the light coming from the upper left-hand side. So everything that's on the opposite side would fall into shadow. So I'm going to very quickly put a soft tone in all of this. And remember, everything that goes under falls into shadow. Everything that goes opposite the side of the light falls into shadow. So here we go. Very soft tone. So I turn my pencil on the side because it enables me to cover a greater amount of space so I can shade a little quicker. So frequently you'll see shading activities in books and so forth where, especially because most people teach you to draw or to shade with a sphere. I do that in other classes as well, but I want, since the purpose of this class is for portraiture, we're using an egg-shaped oval as that's the similar shape of the human head. But so right now we have basically everything on this side or up in here is going to fall. We'll have light on it, light falling onto the top section. Everything on this side is going to fall into shadow, so we have a tone. At this stage, I've seen people use this as an example of the finished concept of shading. It's okay, but it's not very clear. If we were to place our hand over one side of it, you can see that this side creates basically just a colored in shape. If I put my hand on this side, we'll see that this is basically just a shape that has no tone on it at all. So it's not particular three-dimensional. Something that's really important to me and something that I stress in all my demonstrations on shading is that you should never leave light on the edge of the form. That is referred to as rim lighting. Rim lighting, I feel, is very unartistic and just completely destroys form. So leaving this light and then even putting a highlight on the edge will make this flat. You want to avoid rim lighting at all cost. So I'm very quickly now going to continue here, and I'm going to put a half tone on this side so that all elements on the outside are covered with a light tone. So as we can see here, we now have light. In this area, we have light. In all of this section, we now have a halftone. So we now have covered two of the elements of shading. The next step that's really important is the core shadow. So if light's coming from above and falling in here, so frequently I see people make the darkest dark, their core shadow, all the way right here on the edge. However, this is never the case. Once you start to develop your eye and you train your eye to see, you'll realize that the darkest dark, the core shadow, actually falls in here, up above the edge. That is the core shadow, and it very softly blends toward the light. So we'll just carefully blend this a little bit. And now we have our core shadow placed in here along this edge. So now you should be able to see that this is getting a little bit more three-dimensional now, especially if you remember that first stage where I put my hand over both sides and you could see that it wasn't very three-dimensional. It should start to feel like it's wrapping around and becoming more three-dimensional at this point. And that is our ultimate goal, is to have something look very three-dimensional and realistic so that you also have a sense of perspective. So now, by adding this core shadow, we've taken care of a few more elements of shading. So we now have light, we now have halftone, we now have core shadow, and by adding this core shadow and keeping it lighter under here, this created what is known as reflected light. One thing that separates the really great masters of drawing from minor masters is the understanding of form, and in particular the understanding of the use of reflected light. Very few artists have a really exceptional understanding of reflected light. So frequently you'll see drawings that have no reflected light at all. So now we have light, halftone, core shadow, and reflected light. Reflected light is light beaming up from the surface underneath an object, which enhances the three-dimensional quality of the form that you are trying to draw and or paint. But there's a couple things I'd like to point out here right now that you may not realize. Is there's a problem with this, the way I have left the reflected light. So ultimately you want, when you're looking at a form, you want your eye to be drawn to the light. And when we place the highlight in here, you want your eye to be drawn here. But right now when you look at this, and now that I point this out, I hope you notice it, your eye will be fighting back and forth between these two areas. I want my eye to look just at this area only and not to go back and forth between the two. The reason why this is happening is because I have left this a halftone. The value that we have in here is the same value as the halftone that we have in here. So you're going to be naturally drawn back and forth. So you need to always remember when you are including your reflected light, it needs to be slightly darker than the halftone. So now I'm going to blend this a little more carefully here and darken in the reflected light slightly. Again, you want the core shadow to blend into the reflected light, but the reflected light needs to be at a greater value than the halftone. So now we can see the core shadows in here. The reflected light is now blending carefully. It's now darker than the halftone. And now our eye should be drawn more to the light. So let me put a little bit of a tone in here. Blend that a little bit more carefully. So when drawing a portrait, this is the general shape and the general premise that you want to think of when shading the human head. It gets more complicated than that when you're actually doing a portrait because you have all the different features. You have the eyes, the nose, and so forth. But basically, everything on this side of a portrait should fall more or less into shadow. So as you notice, there's no rim lighting. All the light is within the form, so it has a much more of a three-dimensional quality. And now, when we add the highlight, you don't want to make all of this white. It's only a small area in here that receives the highlight. And then we can soften right next to it just a little bit. So we have the intensity in there, then it's softer right near it. So now we are nearing the final stages where we have all the elements of shading now included. So as you can see, we now have a highlight, we have light, we have halftone, we have core shadow, and we have reflected light. So let me just clean this up so it looks a little bit more carefully blended. And I want to try to get rid of as much of the line as possible so that we are looking only at the form of the egg-shaped oval and no longer seeing line. And blend the core shadow just a tiny bit more into the halftone. And if I want to intensify it a little bit more, I can press a little harder and make the core shadow a little darker, but then carefully blending it into the reflected light. If we were doing an actual portrait, we would have the core shadow. We underneath the what would be the chin area, we would have the neck, and the cast shadow needs to be the same value, the same darkness as the core shadow. Cast shadow and core shadow should be the same. For the purposes of this activity, we will not go into that at this point. So let me just soften that little edge here. And round it a little bit more so we get that feeling of it being three-dimensional and it feeling like it is a completed shaded egg-shaped oval. Okay, so next step, we're going to move over here. We'll do a second egg-shaped oval. But we're in the middle section here, in our middle third. I'm going to add, just very subtly, we're going to add a nose. We won't add any of the other features, but I want to add a nose just to show a slight transition from the egg-shaped oval to adding one of the features. So again, light coming from above. Everything on this side of the egg-shaped oval needs to fall into shadow. So I'm going to quickly put a tone over all of this. And remember, we don't want any light on the edge. We always want light with inside the form. We want to avoid rim lighting and try to make it look as three-dimensional as possible. So everything that goes under needs to have a tone, and everything that's on the opposite side of the light must have a tone. So, and I'm going to continue this up just to the side and in here. And then I'll stop at this with the full egg-shaped oval at this point so we can go into the shading the nose and see how it applies when you connect it together with the rest of the egg-shaped oval. So if you're keeping in mind the proportions, and remember in the middle third is where the nose would be placed. And here's this end of the nose. It's like a large ball. And then we have the nostrils would be here on the side. And we have the nasal bones coming in here. Nasal bones coming in here. We have cartilage at the end of our nose. So now, what's really fun about this is we can go over some of the principles here with the nose. So remember right through here, we had core shadow and reflected light. When we shade the nose is somewhat of a ball. So right through here, we want to have core shadow, and then underneath is reflected light. Same with the nostril here. We have core shadow, and underneath we have reflected light. The other nostril, core shadow, reflected light. And beneath the nose, we're going to have the cast shadow. So again, the cast shadow should have the same value as the core shadow. So whatever value we have in here, the darkness of this core shadow should be the same darkness, the same value of the cast shadow. And as the cast shadow moves away from the surface that's creating the cast shadow, it gets softer. So it's darkest in here in the nostril, darkest in the nostril, darkest right under the end of the nose, and it's going to get softer as it moves away. And because the light's coming up from above here, I want my cast shadow to fall this way, and I want it to blend into the form of the egg-shaped oval. And it might seem a little awkward because we don't have a mouth in here at this point, but that's okay. We're just explaining these principles with only one of the features. So light falls on top of the nose. That means the side planes of the nose must have a shadow. So if light's coming up from this side, everything on this side is going to fall into shadow. So I'm going to put a little bit of a tone in here. The side of this nostril is going to have a little bit of a tone, and then the side of the nose. Right in here would be the orbit of the eye, so I'll put a slight tone underneath where the skeletal structure would be, and I'll do the same on this other side. So this would all fall into shadow. We're not going to worry about drawing the eyes, we're just shading the simple forms. So light falls on the top, so we can't leave light on this side of the nose. We have to put a slight tone on this side of the nose as well. And this ball of the nose in here needs to have a slight tone. Okay, and then this plane of the nose is a little bit darker here. And then the light gets softer, the shadow gets softer as it moves away onto that side plane. And then up here on the forehead, remember we have this soft turn up here. We need to have the soft turn here as well, because we're still shading the egg-shaped oval. We're just adding a few extra dimensions in here. So I'm going to darken in slightly a little bit of the shadow of the socket of the eye, side plane of the nose. And then now I'm going to increase the core shadow here of the egg-shaped oval. So this would technically would be where we would have our cheekbone coming down, but it's still in a simplified geometric shape. And you always want to try to connect form to other forms. So I don't necessarily want to leave this here and just leave a sharp edge. So I carefully want to softly blend this in here so that it is connected. A little bit of a tone on this edge. Remember, everything that goes under has a tone, so I'm going to increase the core shadow under here. All this side plane of the nose needs to have a tone. I'm going to connect that a little darker in here, softer underneath here, a little bit darker on this bottom edge, the bottom plane. So here you can see egg-shaped oval. All the principles of shading still apply. Now I've got a little bit of reflected light on this side here that, in my opinion, is just a little bit too light because I want my eye focusing up in here. So I'm going to just blend this a little bit more carefully on the edge. Blend this a little more carefully here. So if you notice, I'm going back and forth between using the point of my pencil and the side of my pencil to help with the shading. There's some areas where I can get more precise using the fine point. In some areas where I can cover larger areas using the side. And I want to make this a little bit more dramatic, so I'm going to increase the shadow just slightly. And in here on the nose, we'll refine this and make it a little thinner. Side plane of the nose. A little darker here on the inside. And core shadow, I want to make this a little bit more dramatic, so I'm going to darken it just a tiny bit more. I want to blend that through. So as you can see here, we've added, just by adding one of the features plus the eye socket, we've made that a little bit more complex in terms of the shading. All the principles of shading still apply. However, they have more variation in them. So if you can shade these basic forms, all those rules of shading will always apply, but they fit into slightly different variations to create the structure. So this didn't have all the complexity. So what we have here is we have the highlight, we have light, we have halftone, we have core shadow, and reflected light. In the case here, just to the nose, we have all of those principles the same. So we're going to have the highlight in here on the tip of the nose. That's going to come, we want that to come toward us. A little bit here on the top plane of the nasal bone. And maybe a tiny little bit of light would fall here on the nostril on this side. So here we have highlight, we have light, we have halftone, we have core shadow, we have reflected light, and then now underneath here, we have cast shadow. And let me clarify this just a tiny bit more with the cast shadow. And the cast shadow gets softer as it moves away. In fact, we want the cast shadow to blend into the form of the core shadow down beneath it. So, highlight, light, halftone, core shadow, reflected light, cast shadow. Then on this outside here, we have halftone, core shadow, and reflected light. So all the same principles apply in both areas, in all of this area, in fact, but there's variation with the added features. So you have to think about all those principles. Now we had the highlight up here. There's usually always a highlight on somebody's forehead. In fact, Rembrandt was a master of painting light. He always would have a nice strong highlight on the forehead and on the nose. That's kind of the two of the focal points for him. So then we can add if this was the actual cheekbone of a human, there would be a little light in here, and there might be a little bit of light on the top of this mouth. There would be another oval shape in here. But for this purpose, we're just going to add a slight tone in there and there. There might be this portion of the skull always has a little bit of highlight in here, so we're going to add that just to give it a little bit more realistic characteristic of the skull. So remember, we don't make all of this area light. We just want to add the highlight, and then we can soften right around it. And I could probably lighten that just a little bit near there and soften this part of the egg-shaped oval, because I still want to think about the whole form of the egg-shaped oval. So here we go. Let's blend that just. I want to make sure you remove all of that line. We just want to see the form. So shading is simply a matter of understanding just basically the 6 elements of shading, which is highlight, light, halftone, core shadow, reflected light, and cast shadow, and then being very patient and very careful with the process. The basic process and understanding of shading is relatively simple, but in order to master the process of shading, it takes a great deal of work and a great deal of time. It's something that you'll develop working on it over years. You're not going to come right out and master shading the first time you try it. And ultimately, in the end, no amount of good shading will redeem a poor concept or something that's poorly drawn. So you always want to make sure that what you're drawing is meets to your satisfaction, and then the shading will then just further enhance your drawing. So we can soften this just a tiny bit so it falls carefully. And maybe we'll just soften a little bit where the cheekbone would maybe be on this side. Thinking a little bit more, making it a little bit more human-like. So, shading the egg-shaped oval is something that's fantastic to practice. You can do this on your own all the time. You could be maybe you're in another class, you have some free time and you're listening to a lecture and you want to doodle on the side. Practice shading ovals, egg-shaped ovals. You can do it in all sorts of different angles. You can change the lighting. You could maybe pretend that there's a portrait and somebody's holding a flashlight from down below, and you can make it bottom lit. You can do all sorts of fun things. And every time you do that, you will just continue to get better and better at shading. Shading is really a great amount of fun. So I was going kind of quick on this, so I didn't fix some of this. So we'll try to just make this a little bit more precise here. So, and there you have it. These are the basic elements of shading. This is one of the final steps. I mean, we can get into compositional design and so forth, but the ultimate part of drawing, you start off with a tetractys. You then begin with a point. You have, when you remove the point, you have a mark or a dot, whichever you prefer to use. Then you move on to line. From line, you want to work into shapes. You can use geometric shapes. You can use organic shapes, depending on what you want to do. In the case of portraiture here, we've used the egg-shaped ovals, which are more of a geometric shape. As we add more anatomy, it becomes more and more of an organic shape. But in the beginning, it's helpful to keep it more geometric. Then from shape, you want to create form. And in the case here where we weren't using line to create form, we're actually jumping right ahead and straight on into shading, which is really a fun and challenging thing to do. And as you see now, you can't really view the line that we began with. It's, for the most part, it's disappeared. And we're looking just at the actual three-dimensional form. In this case, I want the attention drawn up into here with the highlight and the light. The rest should just move around. And in the case of adding just a general basic shape of the eye sockets and the nose should be three-dimensional. It should be coming forward in front of the egg-shaped oval, and then you have a little bit of highlight on where the chin area would be, maybe the top portion of the mouth, and then obviously the top portion of the egg-shaped oval, which would be the forehead, and you begin to have the elements and construction of a human head. So that is a basic overview of the elements of shading, and keep practicing this and you'll get better and better. And it's an infinite challenge. You can work on this for the rest of your life and always come up with some new and interesting way to do this. And each time you do it, you will continue to improve.